Well, we do have plenty to cover today, so I think we'll get started. Some of you almost made it through all the questions. One time we'll have to race, and the people that get through them all will get a prize. They'll have to answer them all in front of everyone. Maybe that's not a good prize. More tea would be a better prize. Maybe chocolate chip cookies. Oh, we'll have to plan for that, like in Easter. We'll have to have a food day again where we bring cookies and things. So I think we do want to start with this conversion of St. Paul. And like I said at the beginning, Caravaggio shows him flying off a horse. Now, this logically fits because anyone?
It's how he became blind?
It's how he became blind. Sure, but what about the horse part? He was a Roman. Well, he's kind of involved in Roman stuff, but he's not a Roman military guy. Think very, very simple. Oh, because he is a Pharisee and his rank? That's possible. He needed some kind of transportation. Yeah, I think at least the answer that I was thinking of, the most logical setting for it, is because Damascus is a long ways from Jerusalem. Did anyone look on a map and figure out how far apart they are? I tried looking it up, and it's a little bit complicated because if you look on a map today or you try typing it in, it'll like route you through different ways and where the roads are, and St. Paul probably didn't ride on modern roads 2,000 years ago, but it's about 125 miles. So even by a horse, that's a journey of several days. I've wondered how far you can travel by a horse on a day. 20 miles? 20 miles, maybe 25 if you go a long ways. But this is a long time. So it's very possible that he was riding a horse. Is it necessary that he was riding a horse? Like, do we know? No. He might have been riding a donkey. Or an alligator. Alligators are less likely, but you know, he was rather upset at the Christians, so maybe riding an alligator would fit. He could be on a camel. That's an interesting prospect. I remember seeing a camel in Israel, and you could ride it. You could pay to ride around on the camel or whatever. And the thing smelled so bad that I didn't even want to get close to it. And they're really tall. Like, they're much taller than horses. They have these weird knobby joints in their legs. But it was not a very nice smelling creature, so I bought a glass of pomegranate juice and watched someone ride the camel. But he could be on a camel. I think the one danger that is important to realize is that we think of camels very often because we think of it as a dry desert. And they didn't travel like directly through the desert all that often. They stuck more to sources of water. So it would be far more likely, for instance, that he would journey along the Mediterranean north and have some of the fresh water from rivers that come out of the hills. That's far more likely than just sort of, okay, Damascus is that way and it's across the desert, so I'm going to ride a camel and ride across the desert. People didn't do that all that often. Saul, or Paul, is intensely persecuting Christianity. And I think it's important to grab on to the intensity of his anger. That this isn't just a little bit, because for him, it's not enough just to persecute Christians in Israel, in Jerusalem. he gets letters and he wants to go all the way to Damascus. How many of you have been so upset that you're like, I'm going to drive 5 days away just to tell someone that I'm angry at them and throw them out of their house? You probably haven't even done that to your kids if you have right to be angry about something. Right? This is a long journey. And he is, being a fire-breathing dragon. And it's important to place the distances in the story, because we sort of think of it like, oh, Paul got on his horse and then he was coming to Damascus and then and then Jesus appeared to him. And it's like, actually not. There's days involved in his anger that are in the middle of this. And, maybe it means that he's been ruminating or thinking about things. Maybe it means that he has been pondering what the will of God is, but somehow there's a journey here. And it's interesting that he's going where in Damascus? To the synagogue. Now, is that what you would expect? Why not? That's a good answer. But he goes to the synagogue. What does that mean? There's Christians that are still at the synagogue. We sort of think of the Christians, we have our own churches. You have your synagogues, we have our churches. But here at this point, you read in the story that the Christians are in the synagogue. And somehow, Paul seems to know about that. They're still participating in Jewish life, and they're considered to be like a sect or a branch of Judaism. And it's like Paul's in a fight about what it means to be really Jewish. It talks about he wanted to find anyone who believed in the way. And this is called halakha, which is a Jewish concept, but it's a really helpful one, because way, like who follow the way, is one of the earliest titles for Christianity in the scriptures, that it's following a way, that Christianity is about a way of life. But the important piece for Christians is that Judaism is also a way of life. It's a way of living. It's a halakha that's based on the rabbinical tradition. And so it's sort of like there's two ways. You can follow the rabbis or you can follow Jesus. But it's a term for the laws and the customs and the traditions that surround Jewish life. It's more than just like the scriptures. There's a whole ethnic identity that Judaism has and that they practice, that they celebrate, and that's what he wants to persecute. And Christianity seems to have picked up on the same idea, that this is a way of living. Yes, it's a faith, but not faith as divorced from life. It impacts how you live. And it says that this moment of Jesus appearing to him happens when he's getting close to Damascus. So it's toward the end of his journey. And he was going to Damascus, he was going to arrest the Christians, and what was he going to do to them? Bring him back to Jerusalem in chains. Exactly, they were going to be forcibly led. That's an important detail to the story. So it says, a light from heaven. In this story, you run into our translation of the New American Bible kind of massacres the text, and we have to put it back because it makes way more sense when you actually see what it's saying. So it says that a light from heaven comes. Not a light from the sky, as if it's just the sky where the stars are and the sun is. I mean, it does mean a light from above, but if you're translating scriptures, the word is heaven, a light from heaven. So a light from heaven comes, and it's a sign of the manifestation of God. The same kind of light comes when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain and the cloud casts a shadow over him. Lots of those words get repeated quite often. And so Jesus appears to him directly, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now he repeats his name twice. This is kind of like in the Old Testament. Do you remember the story of Samuel the prophet? Samuel, Samuel. And eventually Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." There's one author, I forget who, I thought I put it in here, but that when someone's name is mentioned twice, it's usually a rebuke. It's like if your name is mentioned once, it's a good thing. If it's twice, it's like you've done something wrong. Why are you persecuting me? Now this is fascinating because is Saul persecuting Jesus? In one sense, no. Jesus is dead and risen and gone to heaven. Right? Like Saul's not chasing Jesus around trying to prevent him from appearing and disappearing. He's persecuting the followers of Jesus. But in this case, Jesus has identified himself with his followers. That's a really beautiful description of the life of God inside of us. The life of God that's in our hearts. Jesus identifies himself very directly with his followers. It's not, why are you persecuting those who are following me? It's not, why are you persecuting these other people? It's, why are you persecuting me? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then our good old translation breaks things again because it says, who are you, sir? Be very suspicious of the word sir, because he says, who are you, Kyrios, Lord. Why wouldn't you translate it as Lord? This has been like a concept in the Bible for pages already. And they translate it as sir in the New American Bible, but that's not what he says. Who are you, Lord? So already he's recognizing this as a heavenly visitor. This is different. This is something that is pretty dramatic. It's not like sir, like everyone else that you greet. You know, sir, madam, you know. It's not a simple greeting that's normal. This is a greeting that you give to a greater being or someone with greater stature. And he says, I am Jesus. Now here, this is a good translation. That's what he says. But there's a connotation that Paul could not have missed, because he is sort of this rabid Pharisee who's going to arrest the Christians. And Jesus in the story says, ego eimi Jesus, which literally means I am Jesus. But ego eimi is the same phrase that's used in the Old Testament when God speaks at the burning bush. Why would that be important for Paul? He would recognize the phrase because he's a Pharisee. And the Pharisees are followers of Moses. They claim that again and again and again. We are disciples of Moses. This guy, we don't know where he's from. So the disciple of Moses, when Jesus says, I am Jesus, he's going all the way back to the story of Moses. That, I think, is part of why this vision is so earth-shattering for Paul. Because his entire life, he's been zealously following the law. He's been following this way of life, this halakha of Moses, of the rabbinical tradition. And Jesus says, I am Jesus, but he says it in the exact phrase that is used from God to Moses. And so I think it's one of those times where like this final little puzzle piece falls into place and the entire puzzle has changed. Or that somehow that phrase is like the sort of dam breaking. And all of a sudden Paul realizes that this entire thing that he's been doing and this entire faith that he's been practicing just got a new direction. Because God has just identified Jesus with the God of the burning bush, with the God of the covenant at Mount Sinai. And Paul realizes that. And I think that it's important to sit with this a little bit, because this is This is a momentous event. His entire life has just changed in a moment. Some people talk about like the moment when you hear of the death of your spouse, or the moment when someone is diagnosed with cancer, or the moment, for some of you when JFK was shot and killed, the moment when the two towers fell. And it's like a hallmark, a fork in the road, where all of life changes in an instant. That, I think, is what's happening here. But it doesn't mean that all of the aftershocks are fixed, or all of the aftershocks are worked out. When you had the earthquake in Turkey, if you remember, was that a few weeks ago, there were aftershocks for days, and some of the aftershocks were almost as big as the earthquake. And that's kind of like these events where when it happens, it takes a while for it to work out, and the consequences of it are working out. I don't think, Saul got up from the ground and was instantly a saint and instantly full bore for Jesus, and I understand it all, and now I'm going to explain to my Jewish brothers and sisters. I think it took a bit of work. Now, yes, he has that zeal, and yes, he has that desire. Yes, this is a moment in time that is a change, but changes also have these aftershocks that continue to happen for a while, where it's like, oh, so this thing, and oh, wait, so if those are true, then this also, and this prophecy, and it's going to take a while for everything to link up in his mind as to how this works. Why do you think Jesus appeared to him? Or maybe a better way to ask this is, did Jesus appear to Saul like this and cause an earthquake in his life? Or did he appear to many people like this and cause earthquakes? Was it only Saul? Or why him?
Many.
It could be many. Why would you say many?
Because there's some other prophets that fell into line and came out of this reformation, so to speak.
So there's other people. Yes, I think that's true. I think there's more than just Paul. Anyone else want to venture? Patty?
It wasn't just prophets either. I mean, when Jesus was doing the healings, all of them were dramatic, changing the person, 38 years, not able to walk, even in the story today, And,
Yeah.
those were dramatic and life-changing, similar things.
So those are other people. Patty mentioned the man from the gospel today who had been sick for 38 years and how his conversion is dramatic as well. That one happens in the life of Jesus. But I think even after he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, one thing that's important, I would say, is that he likely appeared to more people. I think Russ is right. That there's a few that are recorded in the scriptures, but that doesn't mean that they were the only ones. If you look at the history of the church and the lives of the saints, you find that it doesn't happen every day, but for people that really believe, for people that are really living lives of holiness, it's not all that uncommon or unheard of for Jesus to appear to them. And I think that's an important part of the story, because in a lot of cases, do you ever feel like you say, well, Jesus appeared to Paul, but that's because Paul had this great role in the church and Jesus wanted him and he knew it was going to take something really direct. And, I just don't have that big of a role, so Jesus probably isn't going to appear to me. Do you ever kind of do that? Like divorce yourself all the way, like Paul is over here in the super holy place and we're kind of over here in the not so holy place. And so Jesus appears to Paul and that makes sense, but Jesus doesn't appear to us, and that's because we're not very good at this or something. And I think that kind of thought isn't so good. That's part of the reason why it's important to emphasize that Paul does become a saint, amen. But it's not like a one-day event and that's it. there's more to happen. Angie?
Well, the faith conversions are happening all the time, and probably a small amount of, a very small amount of them actually have visions, have Jesus appear to them. But faith conversions are happening even in our time, all
So
the time.
faith conversions do happen all the time, yes, and it's not always that Jesus appears to people. That's true, but I think he does appear sometimes. And there are people that aren't very ready to admit it. But it does happen, especially when people are more open to it. Paul is quite zealous for the Lord. I mean, he's, hook, line, and sinker sold on this. And so it is going to take kind of a dramatic event to get him. But once you have people like that, they tend to remain fiery. It's one of the reasons why, sometimes these big name atheists or people that debate Christianity on a public stage, if they have a conversion, it tends to be rather dramatic and kind of an earthquake like this, because they're fiery. The ones that are more difficult at the end of the day are actually the ones that are kind of, kind of lukewarm. Book of Revelation, remember how Jesus talks about the lukewarm ones that'll spit out of his mouth? And it's because when you're lukewarm, when you're not moving very quickly, it's hard to get you moving quickly. If you're moving fast in the wrong direction and you change directions, but you're still moving fast, you accomplish a lot. But then what happens to Paul, so he gets blown off his horse. I do like to imagine that. It's kind of fun. Like Jesus appears to him, boom, and Paul goes flying. Surprise! But then what happens to him? He's blind, so he has to get up from the ground and he can't see. So what happens to him? He has to be led. You see how ironic it is? Or it's like this complete reversal. He was going to go into the city and pull the Christians out by chains. And now Jesus surprised him along the way and blew him off his horse. And now he's being pulled into the city. Like it's sort of this reversal. What he thought was going to happen is now the opposite. But it's also a sign. This is where you start to see the layers too, right? Because in a way he's being physically led because he's blind. That makes sense. Like you're blind, you can't see, someone has to lead you. But there's more to it than that. What else is it a sign of? Dependence? Yeah. What else?
Trust, maybe.
Trust? Yep. What is Paul having to grow in now? Faith. And faith specifically in Jesus. You see, because at this point, Paul doesn't know all the answers. It's like he's got this fire raging inside of him, but he doesn't have all the answers. And so now he not only has to be led physically, but he also has to be led spiritually. He's a neophyte. He's a new believer. He doesn't have all of the stuff put together. He's not baptized. He doesn't have the Holy Spirit in his heart like he will later. He has to be led. And the process is probably slow and halting. If you're dealing with someone who's blind, you tend not to move very quickly, or as quickly as they would otherwise, because it takes a while. You have to lead them. But you see how his physical action, being led, is actually also a spiritual action. He's being led, and he's being led in faith. He's on a journey now that's not just his own and not just from inside of him. He's on a journey of what the Lord is doing. Do you kind of see how that fits very well with what is in the story? And to me, that's part of the beautiful richness of this. Like, this is where you dive into the story in a much deeper way. And it's kind of this anticlimax. Now, Paul has to follow someone's voice. He can't see. He's blinded. And again, his blindness is probably also that he doesn't see how all of this works. He doesn't understand everything yet. He knows he encountered Jesus. He recognized him as God. He has this moment of conversion, but now he has to recognize that he was one of the blind ones, that he was blind before he couldn't see. And his blindness was not of his eyes, it was of his heart. So I think when you encounter moments like this, when you encounter phrases like this and events like this, that's kind of the unpacking I would encourage you to do. Like, what does this mean? We talk about being led by faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. There's all of these different phrases that sort of come out. And then you find out that the story fits that description. It does very well. It says the others hear the voice, but they don't see Jesus. Saul rose. Now, I think the New American Bible again says Saul stood up, but it uses this word egero in Greek. And I wish the translation would mark this, because that's the same word that's used for Jesus' resurrection. And so if it's Paul rose, what did he rise from? Spiritually. He was dead. He was dead spiritually. And so it's not just standing up physically, it's also this transition from death to life. And the transition is marked by an encounter with Christ, with Jesus himself. Again, that language, I think, helps us enter into the story, because when he meets Jesus, he's raised from the dead. Not just he stood up, like he was sleeping and now he stood up. There was more to the story than that. He's blind, we talked about that. He's unable to see for 3 days. You start to see how all of a sudden you start thinking about the resurrection, because it used this word, he rose from the dead, and all of a sudden what you have come out is he's blind for 3 days. Well, that fits with the life of Jesus. Jesus was dead for 3 days. Saul is blind for 3 days. Now, it probably means not necessarily 72 hours. Like when Jesus dies on Friday and rises on Sunday, modern brains are like, that's not enough hours. It's like a day and a half. You cheated. But Jewish people counted things differently than we do. So you count the day that you're on, and you count the day that the event happened. So he died, and they just don't have the same sense that 3 days means 72 hours. It's very possible in the life of Paul that it doesn't necessarily mean 72 hours. But what it's saying is that Paul is going through a time in the tomb, a time like Jesus, a time where he is blind and he's trying to figure this out. And he probably doesn't have all the answers. He doesn't have all of the knowledge that he needs. And if you're in a situation that feels out of your control and you don't have all the answers, what's our usual response? Panic, fear, anxiety. What would be a response in a little bit different direction? I know this has happened to you.
Surrender?
Scared. Surrender would be a good thing to happen, but do any of you ever get frustrated?
No.
When you're in a place and you want answers and the answers aren't coming, and is that not kind of our experience? We get frustrated. That could be Paul. I mean, Jesus doesn't say when this is going to change. He's facing the reality that he might very well be blind for the rest of his life. He doesn't know. At least I don't think. Does Jesus narrate the whole thing about Aeneas right away? And go into the city. I think he does, doesn't he? He tells them to find Aeneas. Now, why do you think he tells them to find Aeneas? Oh no, this is Ananias, I bet. For 3 days, let's see. Men who are traveling, who are you, sir? No, he doesn't tell him right away. Does he? Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So he is blind for 3 days. He neither eats nor drinks. And then we have Ananias. Now, who is Ananias? The answer is we don't exactly know. But it's very, very likely that Ananias is maybe a disciple, but very, very likely that he's a priest. That he has been ordained, and we know, or you could suspect that, because what does Ananias do to Paul? He lays his hands on him, he prays for him, and then I'm pretty sure he does something more. He gets up and he was, after that, Ananias baptizes him. So Paul is stuck reeling from the shock of what happened, and Jesus doesn't tell him right away. He encounters his own self-righteousness. He encounters this process. He thought he was holy. He thought that he was on the right path, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do these things because this is what God is calling me to do. And he discovered that his path wasn't the right one. And I think self-righteousness is something that we have to be aware of. It's important to be zealous for the truth. It's important to have a heart that's set on the Lord and seeking what is true and what is good. But it's also that God is bigger than our image of Him. God is greater than who we think He is. And there's a tremendous danger in turning God into who you think He is. It's one of the reasons that the Scriptures are so helpful, where we have to return, because who God is bigger than us. In a lot of cases, we turn God into someone who's disappointed or who's harsh and distant, and Jesus is at pains in the gospel to talk about God as a loving Father, God as a good shepherd, God as the Father of the prodigal son. But there's other times where we turn God into kind of this big teddy bear, and Jesus also has a God who is one who is zealous and jealous for the truth, who's willing to afflict people who are very comfortable, who's willing to call people on the spot and say, that's not right, that's not true, that's not the way. And so we have this need in our lives for our vision of God to be constantly corrected, to be lifted up, to be brought to a better place. We encounter that most fully in the Scriptures, but also in the lives of the saints, in the tradition of the church, in the moral life, that it's not just what we think about it. It's not right or wrong because it's just what you believe. You might believe rightly, that's okay, but you also might believe wrongly. And sometimes our sins could be things that we don't see. Paul didn't see his persecution of Christians as sinful.